the wacky world of the celebrity memoir genre, there's a lot of room for variety. You have the memoirs from the Real Housewives of Palookaville, you have the presidential memoirs you gift your dad every year for Father's Day, and yes, I consider those in the same genre, because as people, all people, we love the drama. We want to know how the sausage gets made, we want to know how the divorce papers are served, and we want to know what happens in the Situation Room. My favorite kind of celebrity memoir is the music memoir, the rock star memoir, the pop star memoir. You know the kind. They have a black and white cover of the artist in their youth, the title is probably the biggest hit they ever had, and you see them everywhere. Goodwill, Target, and there's always a new one on the New York Times bestseller list. And I've read enough of them now to cut through the fat and give you the recommendations of the ones that are actually good and worthwhile. Because trust me, the quality varies. I'm Kate. My channel is named after a Joni Mitchell song, so you can trust my opinions. And my opinions are correct and my own. And this is my Bob Dylan sweater, which is going to be a spoiler for the rest of the video.
You starting?
Yeah, so I'd like you to leave now.
I'll take a picture for the memory. Say hi.
Hi. Why? Why are you doing that?
For memory.
Bye. First, we must ask ourselves, what makes a good music memoir? I've come up with a few qualifications. The first one is an obvious one. Writing quality. Now, I understand it's difficult to be good at more than one thing. Just because you're a good guitarist, songwriter, singer doesn't make you a good writer. However, I do think the preservation of the artist's persona is really important in a memoir, and that also applies to artists who use ghostwriters, who I respect and are very important in this subgenre. The infrastructure of the book needs to be solid before we can build the story on top of it. The second thing a music memoir needs is to know when to start and when to end. A lot of people talk a lot about their childhood, and they don't need to. A lot of people go way out beyond their mainstream relevance, 2 decades on talking about real estate disputes, when we didn't really need that in their rock and roll memoir. So when to start, when to end. This third one is a big one. Is the artist self-aware? The point of a memoir is to be retrospective, and if you're not being retrospective, then what are we all doing here? I need to know how you feel about what happened now and how you felt about it then, how it's changed. Look at the world around you, be self-aware. For example, I always think it's weird when I'm reading a book, you know, that takes place in the 60s and there's like no mention of the civil rights movement. I know we've got limited pages, but if you were a star in 1966 and you like don't mention Martin Luther King, I just think it's a little odd, but that is maybe a personal taste thing too. The fourth thing I need from a music memoir is obvious. Talk about the music. Who inspired this artist? How did their style develop over time? I love the gossip, of course, but without delving into the music memoir just feels a little self-fulfilling and masturbatory and futile. Lastly, and this will sound shallow, is the artist's life interesting? Just because you're like a superstar doesn't mean that your life is that interesting. I'm not going to name names, personally, but not every story is worth telling just because you had like a #1 album. Because sometimes how you got there is just not that interesting to read about. So now I will give my favorite memoirs that meet these qualifications. If you don't see your favorite memoir on this list, it's highly probable that I haven't read it yet. If you missed it before, there's a lot of them. So if you recommend one, you can leave it in the comments below. So let's start with the rock stars. I have, and this is an obvious pick, you knew it was going to be on this list, Just Kids by Patti Smith. First off, this defies the typical formula of a rock and roll memoir. Instead of going front to back through Patti Smith's life, it focuses and really hones in on the relationship with her and Robert Mapplethorpe, who is a photographer. You get a sense that she really loved him, and this book is a tribute to him, it's a tribute to their relationship, and it's a tribute to the times. This is an honest and compelling portrait of like counterculturalism in New York City in the 1970s. Enter the Chelsea Hotel, for example. If you have any interest in punk music or the proto-punk scene, this is definitely essential reading. As for the writing, her prose is raw and vivid. It has the same raw and vivid quality as her lyrics. She's an amazing storyteller. And by focusing on her relationship with Robert Mapplethorpe, the book feels more intentional and curated than a typical memoir. It really There's not a lot of fluff or filler in this, in my opinion. Ultimately, however, this book is about art and artists and expressing yourself. So it really has a little bit for everybody. It's got a bit for the artist, it's got a bit for the punk, a bit for the lover, and I just think that it's really great in understanding that time period, but also understanding how two people can be forever connected to each other. So that was just Kids. Another artist that interpreted the rock genre in their own way is Bob Dylan, but Bobby's kind of always doing his own thing. Chronicles Volume 1 is divided into 5 parts. Each part is focusing on a different segment of the singer's life. For instance, we have 1960s Greenwich Village folk revival scene. We have his recording of 1989's Oh Mercy in New Orleans. While he always keeps his personal life close to his chest, he's candid about his artistic inspiration and musical influences. He dives into the nitty-gritty of album production and the creation of art. Additionally, this book is written with Dylan's classic poetic flair. At his core, he's a wordsmith, so of course his book is great. However, it's been 20 years since the publication of this book, and we still don't have a volume 2, which I have 2 theories about. Either it'll come posthumously, or he never intended to create a volume 2, and he just called it volume 1 for a laugh, which sounds very, very Bobby. The recent memoir that got a lot of buzz is Me by Elton John. This followed the release of his biopic, Rocket Man, and in this biblical plague of biopics that we're currently in, you'd think that this book was a bit of overkill, given that, you know, we just had a 2-hour movie based on his life. However, I much preferred the book to the film. Typical. Elton John's flamboyant personality translates to the written word very well. The writing sounds like him and not an anonymous narrator, and that made the reading experience very enjoyable for me. Additionally, Elton John added a really nice layer of self-reflection in the writing, which I really appreciated, given that I need an artist to be self-aware. For example, while he has a lot of stories about his drug-fueled recklessness and misadventures, he comes at it from an angle of his current sobriety. He's been sober for many decades now, and so instead of glorifying those stories or romanticizing them in the typical way rock stars like to do, he is really honest about his experience with an addiction, that it was self-destructive and humiliating at the time, and that he can have a laugh about it afterwards. I really appreciated, and also hold himself responsible. Elton is also very knowledgeable about music. He went into detail a lot about the music that was happening around him, who influenced him, and he had a wide variety of influences from classical music to bebop to rock and roll. He also went into great detail about his notorious dressing, how he was often outfitted by Bob Mackie, who's a favorite of mine. And so I really like that it has that like fluffy gossip and sequin discussion that you would get in a more bubblegum kind of memoir, but it also has the hard-hitting truths of addiction, making it, like, for me, the perfect example of a memoir. And I really thought it was definitely worthwhile, and one of the standouts from the genre for me personally, which I was not expecting. Now let's talk about folk music. I'm a folkie, obviously. One of my main hyperfixations is the late 1950s, early 1960s Greenwich Village folk revival scene. The undisputed figurehead of this scene is definitely Dave Van Ronk. I mean, his nickname was the mayor of MacDougal Street, so he was definitely not self-elected, but seen as a real leader in this community. He's definitely has ties to Bob Dylan, for instance. This posthumous book of the same name, The Mayor of MacDougal Street, dives into the scene, the city, and the people. This book was an extremely valuable read for me in understanding those 3 things. How the music developed, how people felt. It corrected a lot of misconceptions I had about the time. It's, for me, essential reading about the genre and the movement. But it's also a great memoir about Van Ronk himself. His musical development, for instance, is a really interesting read, and I learned a lot, and I still think about it. Now we have to talk about the queen of folk, Joan Baez. And if I talk about Joan Baez too much, I will start weeping. So this is definitely a biased selection for this video, but I have to talk about her memoir, And a Voice to Sing With. This is a bit of an older publication. I think it was released in the mid to late 80s. and by the look of it, I got an older copy. I got this at a thrift store. And this book, just like Joan herself, is often overlooked, but I found this really great and really valuable. She's often overlooked in history, especially in discussions about Bob Dylan. She's more than just Diamonds and Rust. And this is on my mind because I just watched A Complete Unknown, and I felt like Joan Baez was 5% of that movie when she should have been like 25% of it. But I'm biased. Even though I don't like talking about her always in conjunction with Bob Dylan, this book was really interesting as like a retrospective of their relationship at that 25-year mark. Remember, this is from the mid-80s. But beyond the Dylan of it all, she talks about the civil rights movement. She has stories about Martin Luther King that'll blow your mind. The things that she did, the way she put her life on the line, and all of her great humanitarian efforts and her activism is really highlighted here in a way that you won't find anywhere else. It takes her own voice to say who she is, because I just don't trust anyone else in talking about Joan. For instance, she goes on a trip to Vietnam, and while there are American bombs raining down on her, she's in a bunker singing to the people. And I think that perfectly illustrates who Joan is. But she also is deeply funny and deeply talented. She's a great musician and a good songwriter, and I'll just say this. Do yourself a favor and research Joan Baez. Maybe read this if you have to. You will be blown away. I guarantee it. Next, I want to talk about Lady Sings the Blues by Billie Holiday. This book was co-written with William Duffy, who is a journalist, an activist, a musician. I could describe to you the fierce and intense nature of this book, or I could just read you the first line. Mom and Pop were just a couple of kids when they got married. He was 18, she was 16, and I was 3. This book is an unflinching account of Billie Holiday's childhood in Baltimore, her come up in Harlem nightclubs, playing with Count Basie. It's about addiction, it's about racism, it's about sexism, it's about her really tough but powerful and interesting life. And to include this in a list of memoirs seems a bit foolhardy. It seems a bit shallow, because this for me is more than just a memoir. It's a timeless testament of anguish, and it's essential reading. Everybody in school should read this, and I think that it's really incredible for jazz musicians, for non-musicians, for non-Americans. I think that this is incredibly important. So those were my personal top 5 that I would recommend as your music memoir starter pack. Now I want to do a bit of a lightning round where I just rattle off a bunch and see if I can do it quickly. We'll see. I'm notorious for yapping. Recently I loved Carole King's A Natural Woman. She provided a much needed female perspective of the 1960s and 70s. She talked a lot about the changing times, about womanhood, about motherhood. I really even appreciated her talking about the changing of recording technology in the early 70s. I thought that was really interesting. She has some points deducted from me though, because she dragged out a little at the end. She sort of breaks that rule that I established earlier of knowing when to start and end. However, I am recommending the book anyway, because I think that it's incredibly valuable, because we don't often see that side of the 60s, 70s music scene. Another important part of rock and roll history that is often overlooked and misunderstood is the groupie scene, which is why I have to recommend you I'm With the Band by Pamela Des Barres. Pamela is one of the most notorious groupies of that age, and you'd think that this book would be like a smutty tell-all of all the rock stars that she slept with, which it sort of is, but it's also way more than that. It's a testament to fangirling and fandom in general, and it's about girlhood, it's about hopeless romance, it's extremely self-aware and funny and interesting and shocking, and I think that it's a great read if you like this sort of books. It's definitely a way to branch out. Please Kill Me, An Uncensored History of Punk, is a collection of transcribed interviews by proto-punkers, post-punk, punk in general. It's just the history of the punk genre over 20 years. It's grimy, it's intense, but it also has this humorous tabloid quality about it. For instance, it's just people talking about each other oh, Nico gave Iggy Pop the clap, and that is really funny to me, of just these hardcore individuals just being petty high schoolers, but it's more than that. It's also about the spirit of punk and what's wrong with punk and what's right with punk and how it changed over time, and I think that it's a really great book. The History of Bones by John Lurie is less of a music memoir and is more a memoir about general New York City 1980s counterculturalism. Lurie crossed into cinema with his work with Jim Jarmusch, and visual media as he was friends with Jean-Michel Basquiat. He was a saxophonist for an avant-garde jazz band. He also did some directing. He's also a painter. He name drops Andy Warhol, Madonna, Debbie Harry. However, it's also a bleak portrayal of addiction and New York City at its most dangerous era. And if you like bitching, John Lurie is great at bitching, and it's 300 pages of bitching, which I find endearing. So if you find that endearing, I definitely recommend that one too. Okay, that's all I have to say for now. That was 10 music memoir recommendations. For me, the cream of the crop, but really we're only scratching the surface of this genre. I'm reading music memoirs all the time, so as soon as I have another 5 or 10 to add to this list, I'll make a sequel to this video. But for now, happy reading! Okay, party on, Garth. Okay, bye. Okay, bye.